As long as we've done this show, growing Michigan and getting it into gear to be competitive against the rest of the country has been a topic. Honestly, it sometimes feels like I'm screaming into the void, the padded walls of the studio being a metaphor for feeling like I'm insane for pushing things to be better. Because as much as we love our city, region, and state, there is work to do. There has been for years. After all, Michigan is second to last in the nation for attracting people from other states, and that, mixed with our well-documented brain drain, has not been a good recipe. So how do we wrestle with all of this? I'm Jairus Days, and on your Daily Detroit for Monday, June 10th, 2024, Michigan has a newish Chief Growth Officer, Hilary Doe. We sat down at the Mackinac Policy Conference to talk about this in what I think will be the first of a few conversations around this. Let's get into it after we pay a bill. Whether it's time to replace your roof, repair it, inspect it, or get your gutter cleaned, Best Choice Roofing provides top-notch roofing services tailored to meet the unique needs of Detroit homes and businesses. They serve the region and inside the city of Detroit, too. Find out more at bestchoiceroofingdetroit.com. That's bestchoiceroofingdetroit.com. Or call 313-474-7031. That's 313-474-7031. And be sure to support the businesses that support us. Joining me at the table at the Grand Hotel at the Mackinac Policy Conference is none other than Hilary Doe, Michigan's Chief Growth Officer. Welcome to Daily Detroit. Good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, there's so much that we could talk about. I think there could probably be like a multi-part series.
Let's do it.
But today, I think we want to focus on something that I think is kind of ties into everything. So, this conference talked about attracting talent and education and da-da-da-da-da. But kind of a core at this is population growth. Mm-hmm. And you have a new poll out. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about it.
Yeah, I'd love to.
So what are some of the things? I mean, I'm looking at some of the statistics here. It's actually like a pretty significant poll, like sample size.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. We did a national poll. We were polling folks in, cities across the country, especially ones that have been popular with young talent, both those that have been really growing quickly, places like Austin and Nashville, for example, but also places that have attracted the most young people each year. So places like New York and LA. And yeah, we ended up with a sample of over 6,000 folks between 18 and 34. And the reason that we did that is because, the U.S. Census Bureau shows us that folks 20 to 34 are some of our, most mobile folks. They're most likely to move. And so when we think about, a value prop that works for talent attraction and retention, we want to make sure that we're hanging on to the folks that are most likely to move here in Michigan, and that we have a value prop that works to attract folks from across the country.
So what are some of the things that you found?
Yeah, so we tested or polled, I suppose, a lot of things, as you probably saw in the results. But what we were really interested in is, what are some of the factors that you're looking for in a place to call home? And some of the results I thought were really, really interesting. But the bottom line was safety really was a critical issue to young folks. And that was a difference from what you used to see when you polled, millennials. I'm a geriatric millennial, so I feel like I can say that,
Elder millennial.
An elder millennial.
Elder millennial.
That's so much kinder. Thank you.
I'm trying to be kind, but my listeners were not, so they totally labeled me geriatric.
Yes, okay. Well, as, elder or geriatric millennials, but very sophisticated millennials, we can say that. But yes, safety really came to the top. Community safety was important, but also really critical to folks in this poll was a diverse community, a welcoming community in terms of things folks are looking for. Those were really, critical factors, but also things that we saw and heard from Michiganders as we were, traveling the state. Folks want amenity-rich, walkable communities. They want transit. Those things really shot to the top as well. So those were some of the findings initially in terms of community factors.
Now, in your position, you have to deal with a lot of people, of different ranges and different power levels and all that stuff. How much of this story, now that you've been in this position a little bit,
yeah.
Like how much of this is wrestling with like preconceived notions or like, well, this is how I did it, or this is what I want to see, and like having those different life experiences clash?
Yeah, no, it is interesting. Over the last 8 months, I think there's been a little bit of myth busting. I used to joke, sometimes I feel like, instead of chief growth officer, chief myth buster or something, because I think we are all, no judgment, right? Walking around with an idea of what might work based on what worked for us, And so I think it's really important to not guess, but really talk to to our, young folks in Michigan and talk to young folks across the country and believe them, listen to what they have to say. And we certainly did a lot of that. We really prioritized public engagement. Over the last 8 months, we've talked to thousands and thousands of Michiganders in person and received feedback from over 11,000. And now we're doing, a really, fair amount of national polling to really get underneath the facts of what folks are looking for. And I'll give you one example. A really common thing that we hear from young people across the state and across the country is housing and how motivating access to housing is. In this poll, when asked what a program or a talent attraction incentive could be that would be really motivating, we were just testing, all kinds of potential options because the talent war is competitive. Cities and states across the country are rolling out these programs. And we were curious what might be motivating for folks in these shoes. And the one thing that blew everything else out of the water was a down payment or support in accessing home ownership. And that's been really consistent and was consistent in, talking to young people across the state as well. But when I first started having conversations, 8 months ago with some folks in Michigan, I heard pretty regularly, oh, but housing here is more affordable. We have relatively low cost of housing. We shouldn't worry about, housing support. When you look at the data, though, Michigan is still, pretty rent burdened. It's not just the cost of housing, it's your housing relative to incomes, right? And so we have to really listen to folks and look at all the data to get a good sense of this stuff.
And doesn't all that kind of tie together, right? Because how much you make also impacts how much you can afford for housing
Absolutely.
As a percentage. And I know that's like another math to do, and math is annoying, but I think it's important to look at that
It's
math.
critical. It's absolutely critical, yeah. So in the comparative analysis that we did last year, we looked at faster growing peer states, and they actually compared Michigan, to all our faster growing peers. There were 6 states there in total, and we were 5th out of 6 in terms of rent burden. So pretty heavily, rent burden place. So yeah, for our existing Michigan residents, we need to think about that. That's why we're working hard to get more housing stock online. And I think when we're looking at, an opportunity we have nationwide where there are higher, costs for housing, that's another opportunity, right, for us to think about ensuring that, housing access and housing could be a competitive advantage.
So you're getting all this data. You've been doing this listening tour, all this other stuff. What are some of the actions that you're starting to brew with this?
Yeah. Well, there's kind of in 3 buckets. So we launched the report in December and had a set of policy recommendations there. It's been really great actually to see how much momentum those are getting legislatively. You never know with a report like this. And so we saw a bunch of those recommendations in the governor's budget, things like the Innovation Fund, things like the 2 years of access to community college and others. But we've also seen the legislature really express interest in some of these things. I credit all the public engagement work to that, honestly. So I give the credit to Michiganders. They showed up in droves, packed rooms, and I think legislators noticed, that folks in their district care about this stuff, and so they're really showing that they care. And we saw, for example, legislation introduced around childcare, which was a key concern we heard across the state, and it showed up in the recommendations. So there's action happening in that regard. The other area that my office is working on, in the growth office, are pilots. So we know that growth's going to look different in the UP than it looks in Detroit, for example.
And that was one of my concerns, looking
exactly.
at looking at that Growing Together Michigan report. Yeah. It's like there's just so many needs, and also certain communities, they envision growth in a different way. And I think that's one of the challenges. I think Michigan, don't quote me on this, but I think we're like the size of like the UK or something as far as land area. And that's going to mean a mosaic of things as opposed to one solution.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And so when we looked at the recommendations in the report, my office basically said, here are the ones that, can be implemented statewide. And there are a lot of things we shouldn't do in that way, right? Because they're going to be so regionally specific. So next month, we're actually rolling out these talent attraction and retention pilots to let communities have community voice and say, hey, if we're going to try to, retain our young folks here, our value prop is really different and unique in this community than it is in another one. So we're going to help support them in rolling out a program that's uniquely tailored to their place, see what works and what doesn't, and then hopefully help them scale things that are really effective.
Now that you've been in this position a little while, what is something that you thought you knew but learned different?
That's a great question. I guess, one thing that I thought I knew perhaps, but have learned differently, I always knew how important storytelling was, but I've been struck at the extent to which it's important. I am a big fan of, marketing. I spent the last 10 years of my career in tech, and we did a lot of work, supporting folks building movements and things like that. So, I get the importance of storytelling, but honestly, we're 49th out of 50 right now, Michigan is, in terms of folks who live here that weren't born here. So we're second to last in the nation at attracting folks to Michigan from other states to choose Michigan as their home. And I joke that should be reserved for some dusty square state somewhere. But it's a wild sort of fact to me, and it keeps me up at night. And it really underscores to me that we've got to be telling our story. So in addition to all the policy work we're doing, we really have to make sure that we're, engaged in that continuous improvement, but we're also really sharing Michigan's story. And I just want to brag for 2 seconds. But last week, our You Can in Michigan campaign, the new talent campaign we launched, it's only been in market 6 months. It's already driven 7,000 folks through a jobs portal to say, hey, I want to live and work in Michigan, but it also won 11 Telly Awards for marketing. And we're just ahead of other states at this point. So even though we do have this big challenge, we now have, momentum, and we're ahead, and other states are trying to catch up. And that's a good place to be.
Now, when I worked at the Detroit Regional News Hub years ago, one of the things I learned, I walked into that job thinking, listen, people don't like Detroit. There's all these negative perceptions. What I found was actually it was easier to tell Detroit's story to reporters in other places. And sometimes my biggest challenges were when I was working with a TV station locally or a radio station, and they're like, well, I've never been to Detroit. Like, I literally talked to a reporter that had never been to Avalon Bakery before, or something like that, right? All these places, they're just common as a Detroiter. They had never seen those things. And so that makes me think about when we talk about these talent attraction strategies, everything else, sometimes the pushback is, well, everything's fine because it's fine for them individually.
Sure.
And not seeing the bigger picture. Do you run into that sometimes? And what would you say to someone who says, why should I change? Why should I have more people in my neighborhood? Why do we need to grow?
Sure. We do hear some of those things sometimes. I would say one thing that's been pretty striking, to your point about, maybe folks outside of the state actually sometimes having a different or better perception. One thing I noticed was we do have exposure issues that we need to bust through, even with folks in our own state. So especially when we're talking to our young folks who are, in high school and college or what have you, a lot of times, they maybe never have been to our biggest city, or they've never maybe seen Lake Michigan or what have you. And do we have a right to retain those folks in our state if they haven't experienced, what our state has to offer? And I really have been asking myself that, so when I think about our talent retention strategies, I'm really building and thinking about how we build program to ensure that even if folks chose to live in New York for 5 years, they knew it was waiting for them at home if they chose to come back, so ensuring that we've exposed folks to what is available to them here in Michigan feels critical. And I think we, have room to grow there, really. I'm in Michigan. And I'll just share one little anecdote with you to your point about folks saying, grow Michigan, but don't grow it here. When I got this job, the first conversation I had was in the UP, and that's exactly what the first person said to me: grow Michigan, but don't grow it here. Because folks have this idea maybe of what growth means and assume I meant the biggest condo buildings, that we could find. But we sat there together, we really listened, and they, by the end, said, hey, if you mean by Grow Michigan, ambulance drivers and opportunities for my kids and grandkids, then I'm all about it. And I think the secret there is a lot of listening, a locking arms, letting community voice dictate growth that's, specific region by region, and really, ensuring that we're all into this together. And I do think that there's a path for that. I think it's harder, and I think it requires patience, but that's what this is going to take.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people fear change.
Sure.
I mean, that's just like a human nature thing.
Sure. Yeah.
And working through that, I think is crucial, because you want to respect the wishes of people who live here already and
Absolutely.
who have invested in all that stuff. But there's also like just so much more opportunity in so many places where, we could build in one place more densely and add a bunch of people, and to me, I sometimes feel like it's about sharing like a big vision, whether it's transit, whether it's housing, whether it's whatever, and saying, instead of looking at Detroit, I'm just going to pick on Detroit as an example. Oh, we grew 1,800 people or whatever.
Sure.
Why don't we talk about growing 18,000 people? Because you know what? We got room. I lived here when there was 350 plus thousand more people in the same, and it was fine. Yeah. Like I remember that. Okay. If Michigan were to grow like that in Detroit, and that's a huge plus.
Yeah, I do think that we need to think, not just about tomorrow, right, but about the sort of grand vision, so we can get excited about that together and be patient enough to chase it. It's not going to happen in 6 weeks or 6 months, right? So we have to know what we're all running after together and really work on it together. So yeah, it's the kind of thing that's going to take all of us. It's not going to be done in one political administration. So Michiganders really have to own it and want to get it done together, but I'm feeling pretty optimistic.
You were talking about timelines, and I do want to get into that because I hear two things. Like, great, the grand vision is awesome, 2050, right? But 4 years from now, 8 years from now, their lives have been changed.
Of course.
And so what are some of the things that's like, people get a little tired, I think, of like, well, here's another plan for 4.
Totally.
But 4 or 8 years from now, I'm going to be in a different place. So somebody who is 28 years old right now is going to be in 8 years 36, and it's a whole nother situation.
Yeah.
So how does one wrestle with balancing that and feeling like we're making progress and showing it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think there's always that balance, right, when we're trying to accomplish these big things together at, knowing what we're chasing, but also delivering incremental progress that we can all celebrate along the way. And that's really how I'm thinking about this balance, that we're, for example, chasing these big legislative priorities, like we're trying to move the ball down the court on things like, if we were to move the ball down the court on transit, which we know is so critical and we all want to do that, it's not going to deliver results tomorrow. Transit takes a minute, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time as we do that, we should be trying to deliver an incremental progress around talent attraction retention right now. Sort of things that we can do that we can celebrate and see the results of much more quickly to keep us all going, right? And to keep us all motivated. So there really is that balance there that we're, really trying to push through and get right. And that also gets back to storytelling too. None of those things will be clear to anybody unless we're figuring out how to communicate about them and bring everybody into the fold. And I also think every Michigander has a role to play there. If Michigan is the one that sings Michigan is cool, nobody will believe it. We know the MEDC can't run a high production value campaign saying, we promise, believe us, Michigan's really great. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We can do.
I hear Eminem does ads now. So.
Our campaigns are important and great, but they serve a really specific role. We also want, other people that love our state to be ambassadors for it.
Well, that's something I learned. So years ago, I worked on the Live Downtown incentive program, doing marketing with that. One of the many hats I've worn over many years. And one of the things I found was really effective was not a campaign focused on CEOs and leaders. It was focused on, hey, neighbors, people who are actually in that community.
Sure.
And that was way more resonant and way more authentic because it's like that word of mouth thing,
Yeah, well, and I also think neighbors will know what considerations they should be highlighting that are going to be really compelling to folks, more than anybody else will, right? They'll be better at attracting folks who are like them than anybody else will be. And that's true for each individual person, attracting their own community. And so that's like the power of, folks doing their own like peer-to-peer outreach and engagement. And actually that reminds me of a piece of the poll that I really thought was interesting, would love to share. We talked a little bit about the high-level results across the entire sample. We also dug into what parents said specifically, and it was really interesting because it changed the result a little bit. So I mentioned down payments and housing access were sort of the most compelling factor. The second most compelling across the whole sample was support with student loans because they're so burdensome for so many folks. But if you look at parents only, the factor that shot to the top was a state that offered things like universal pre-K, those kinds of supports. So even our state policies were really critical. The other thing that showed up was a desire to live in a state that invested in climate action, for example, was a really critical thing. A state that invested in and supported some basic rights, reproductive health, those things were major considerations. And when you look at some of our demographic slices, Black folks, for example, really prioritized how critical it was to invest in our cultural institutions. So I just think looking at some of that, sort of those specific segments provides so much important information for us as we're thinking about, the decisions we make in our policy landscape here in Michigan and what we're talking about and like offering, because we've made some of those bold, brave decisions here. And there are some of them actually in the budget right now around universal pre-K, for example. So it'll be interesting, what is a compelling package for folks when they're thinking about Michigan. For
sure. And to be honest, the imaginations of a state budget are not necessarily the easiest stories to cover or share for the public, but I think they're important because what I feel like with this conference is there's a lot of ground being laid this year.
Sure.
A lot of work being laid. So I hope that we will catch up again soon, but I will ask with this final question.
Great.
If we were to get together a year from now,
Yes.
what do you hope has happened or moved forward that we can talk about as a success from your perspective?
Yeah, I think in a year from now, I'd love to be able to celebrate that we've moved the needle, that we've put numbers on the board as a result of these talent attraction and retention campaigns. To your point about long-term versus short-term and getting some wins, I think we need to show people in these regional pilots that we can have an impact, that we can put these pilots in the field, we can see results, and I think we will. The other thing I think we'll see is a nation-leading storytelling effort that we can all be really, really proud of. So I can't wait to celebrate those things with all of you.
Hilary Doe, thank you so much for your time on Daily Detroit. I appreciate you.
I'm excited about it. Thank you.
All right, what are your thoughts? Let me know, dailydetroit@gmail.com. With that, I am Jer Stays. Thank you so much for listening to your Daily Detroit. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around town. Talk tomorrow.